wasn't just to seize the eastern part of Ukraine. In fact, they never even, their first move was to Kiev to try and seize. They're obviously keen to seize the whole of the Ukraine, whether they do it now or whether they do it later. I think if you platonically say we must talk peace, then you know there has to be some sort of hope of peace on the table, and there is not. So I tend to support the comrades who align themselves openly with the people of Ukraine, because they are under attack and they are looking for solidarity. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Paul. If we take Imran next, then I'm going to invite some of the comrades in the room to come and make their contributions. So are you ready to go, Imran? Yes. You're muted, Imran. Imran, you've got your mute on. So.
Thank you so much, comrades. I hope I'm audible. And it's a privilege for us to be part of this Congress. And first of all, something about what happened today. It's not our fault, and we believe that it makes no sense for a person who calls himself Marxist to leave a Congress a meeting like this after slandering and abusing and swearing at other comrades and accusing them of being imperialist agents and imperialist puppets. And after listening to what Comrade Roger said in his marvelous lead-off, I'm sure that if those people would have been here right now, they would label Roger Silverman too as an imperialist agent. So coming to the point of this session's agenda, first of all, like we have read Comrade Roger's document very carefully, very keenly, and it's a marvelous document. It's well written with a lot of information, a lot of statistics, and very sound analysis. But there are some problems of emphasis which can be overcome with after all this discussion that we are having here in this session. So, as Comrade Roger has mentioned, like there is not a single process in the Ukrainian conflict, but there are many processes, simultaneous processes that are going on and overlapping each other. One of them being the inter-imperialist rivalry between the US imperialism and the Russian imperialism. And another process is the fight of the Ukrainian masses for their self-defense, for their self-determination. So these two processes shouldn't be confused with one another. And that's the main problem in the Marxist tradition today, that people confuse these two processes, these two aspects of the conflict with one another, and end up supporting Putin most of the time, but sometimes like they fall into the US imperialist camp, and they kind of directly or indirectly support NATO. So I have written a short kind of a contribution which I would like to present. So first of all, if we go into the historical background, that after World War II, the USSR and the US divided the world into their respective spheres of influence, and both superpowers had somewhat equivalent military might. However, eventually the USSR, the Soviet Union, fell behind the US in armaments competition, and it was far behind US economically already. So after the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine became an independent state, at least in its appearance, in 1991 by a referendum. And details of that referendum has been mentioned by Comrade Roger. But one thing that we must consider while dealing with the Ukrainian conflict is that we cannot ignore the historical national oppression and imperialist exploitation of the Ukrainian people by the Russian masses, which went on for like centuries, and it continues even to this day. So for generations, the Tsarist Russia had repressed and exploited Ukraine economically, culturally, and politically, as any imperialist power would do. And after 1917 revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin and Trotsky embraced an internationalist Marxist position toward oppressed people and the revolutionary state, granting them the right to self-determination and secession. A voluntary socialist federation in that part of the world and beyond was the objective of the leaders of the Russian Revolution. But a few years later, as we know, with the degeneration of the Russian Revolution and the Soviet state, Stalin replaced Lenin's Marxist national policy with a chauvinistic and oppressive one. And we know that, as some comrades have mentioned, that the oppression on the Ukrainian people during the Stalinist era was even worse than it was during the Tsarist era. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union was caused by discontent within Russia, which was fueled by a bureaucratically planned economy, censorship, and state repression. But we must also keep in mind that it was also caused by the national feelings of national deprivation in Eastern Europe and Central Asian people, who sought to break free from the Russian dominance and control, which was commonly called the Russification, and which the counter-revolutionary Soviet bureaucracy had adopted after Lenin. The working people of Ukraine have long felt national deprivation and oppression, and the Russian state has always been seen as an oppressor and an imperialist force. After the USSR collapsed, Russia became the capitalist state under the gangster or mafiosi administration, which was headed by Putin, and he became an authoritarian representative of the reactionary and corrupt class of Russian capitalists who first looted and destroyed Soviet Union as a part of Stalinist bureaucracy, and then became billionaires by stealing and plundering public assets during the privatizations after 1991, during Boris Yeltsin years, and also under Putin. Today, even in its crisis, the U.S. imperialism remains the world's most powerful imperialism. It's kind of a superpower in the world, not only militarily but also economically and culturally. Yet, in many parts of Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, including Ukraine, Russia still operates with its imperialist designs and seeks to expand its power. One thing which I found missing in Roger's document is the mention of the Wagner Group. The Azov battalion has been mentioned in the document, and many other the fascist groups in the Ukraine. But the Wagner Group, supported and propped up by the Russian imperialism, is no less fascist. And we all know that the people who were convicted criminals have been recruited into Wagner Group, and they are being sent to Africa and Middle East, and maybe also in Latin America. So the presence of the Wagner Group in many parts of the world bear witness to this fact that Russia has its own imperialist projects and its own imperialist designs. So regardless of how we view the former Soviet Union, whether we call it a degenerated worker state or state capitalism, Russia's current invasion of Ukraine is part of its design as an imperialist capitalist state trying to expand its influence in the region and the world. We all know that imperialisms never admit their reasons for attacking other nations. World War II was a struggle between the imperialists for world supremacy, although the US and its allies claimed to be fighting fascism, and the fascism in its turn, the German fascism, claimed to be protecting the integrity of Germany. Similarly, the invasion of Iraq was justified by the so-called weapons of mass destruction. So it goes. The imperialist invasions have always used such lame excuses and arguments. In the similar vein, Russia claims its invasion of Ukraine to denazify the Ukraine and stop a supposedly genocidal environment there against the Russian population. However, the Ukrainian parliamentary elections demonstrate that barely 2% of people in Ukraine support the far-right nationalists, which is much less than that of France, Germany, Italy, and most other European nations. This is a fact which is mostly like overlooked by analysts, and like Ukraine is labeled and stereotyped as a nation with where majority of the population believes in the fascist ideas and is associated with the fascist groups, which is absolutely false. So Putin also declares that the NATO expansion prompted Russia to attack Ukraine to defend itself from Western aggression. However, Russia itself is an imperialist power that has the biggest army in Europe and world's largest nuclear arsenal, not to mention numerous other advanced military hardware, technologies, and weapons. Russia has at least 4 times the per capita GDP of that of Ukraine. The ratio of the Russian per capita GDP with the Ukrainian per capita GDP is identical to that of Pakistan and Afghanistan. Russia has
We've got about 10 minutes now. Start drawing to a close, please. Thank you. We've had about 10 minutes now. Okay.
Okay, I'll try to just summarize what I'm trying to say.
Okay, pick up, please. Thank you.
Okay, and Russia has 140 million people, whereas the Ukraine has only the population of 35 million. So, the point I'm trying to make is that Lenin always began his analysis of international warfare by asserting whether the course would enhance or weaken the international working class. And it is crucial to remember that Lenin and Trotsky both distinguished between the oppressor nations and the oppressed nations or the dominant nations. So when it comes to the Ukrainian conflict, oppressed nations' right to self-determination includes the freedom to resist the imperialist aggression in any way they choose. The strong resistance by the Ukrainian people up till now has made Putin's military designs in Ukraine almost impossible to implement. Supporting ordinary Ukrainians' right to fight the Russian invasion does not, however, entail supporting the Ukrainian ruling class and the Putin regime. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has paradoxically strengthened NATO worldwide, and it has justified its expansion, as has been mentioned by many comrades. It has also given Zelensky's dictatorial regime a good opportunity of enacting anti-working class, anti-democratic measures that must be rejected and fought with full class solidarity and socialist program. The strategy for revolutionary defeatism, and I want to emphasize this point, that the strategy of revolutionary defeatism only applies to the inter-imperialist conflicts, especially the global ones. And the current war in Ukraine is not an open inter-imperialist war at the moment. Ukraine is not an imperialist power. NATO has not yet directly entered the battle despite Western imperialism's military and financial assistance for Ukraine. Both they and China have refused to take direct actions in this conflict. Thus, it is not yet a worldwide inter-imperialist battle. But if such a situation occurred, the revolutionaries would have to reconsider the whole situation and form their policy according to the new emerging situation. Regarding the war in Ukraine, we must resort to Marxist tactics in comparable situations. In the context of imperialist invasion by Japan of semi-colonial China, Trotsky had proposed the policy of fighting against the Japanese invaders for the Chinese working masses, without abandoning their political program and organizational class independence, even when the Western imperialist forces were supporting the Chinese nationalists against Japan. During the Russian Revolution, a similar policy was adopted by the Bolsheviks during the Kornilov uprising, in which they waged a political struggle against the Kerensky government at that time, at that particular movement of that time, and a military struggle against the Kornilov forces. Similarly, in the transitional program, Trotsky...
I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to stop.
I'm just finishing.
People wanting to speak.
I'm just finishing it.
2 more sentences,
I'm just... Okay. Similarly, in the transitional program, Trotsky had emphasized the point that not all wars are same, and in the war between China and Japan, or the USSR and the Nazi Germany, the proletariat can't be neutral and would support China and USSR from an independent class position. So I'm just finishing it up. So what should be our policy in Ukraine? First of all, we should demand an immediate withdrawal of Russian forces from the Ukrainian territories. Secondly, we must admit and recognize the right of Ukrainian masses of their self-defense, of resistance, and of self-determination. Similarly, we should demand a right of self-determination for all the Russian-speaking population living in Ukraine, as Comrade Roger Silverman has earlier mentioned. Similarly, we should make a demand of complete dissolution of NATO and stop to all its further expansion in the eastern part of the Europe. And to sum up, we must raise the slogan of Union of Soviet Socialist Republics of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Russia once again, based on voluntary basis, in which all these ethnic conflicts and these national oppression and imperialist exploitation can come to an end. On the basis of our defense of the right of the Ukrainian people to be a free country, we should also say that in the areas just the last sentence. And we should develop our policy. Okay. And to develop our policy against the war, we should continue to strive to strengthen a revolutionary organization within Ukraine, within Eastern Europe, within Russia, and all over the world. Thank you.
Brilliant. I was extremely impressed by your passion, your rhetoric, Imran. That was brilliant. But we do want to bring some of the comrades in now. So I'm going to bring in next. We've got 3 comrades in the room that want to speak next. So I'm going to bring in Patrick first, then Temos, and then Frank, and then we'll return to the speakers on Zoom. Okay.
Okay, thank you. As Roger said, in the lead of, my wife is Ukrainian, which means that I live with this war every day, because she wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning to see if her house was bombed, or the old school that she went in was bombed, or something like this. I also have this young guy, just as like Roger said, a lot of her relatives now lives as refugees in Europe. And I must say, for different reasons. This guy, young guy, lives in our apartment. He came to Sweden because he didn't want to go to the army. Some other relatives, they are afraid of persecution of Russian-speaking people. They are afraid that the persecution that's been going on so far will get worse. And they think that maybe they will never be able to return to Ukraine because of them being Russian speakers. And some, they want to have a better life. They found good jobs in Europe and they want to make more money than they make in the Ukraine. So there are different reasons for leaving Ukraine. So anyway, some of the debate on Ukraine, some of the right wings in Sweden, they have been saying that we need to listen to the Ukrainians. And my question then is, which Ukrainians should we listen to? Because there are different kinds of Ukrainians, and there was now one of the bosses of the recruitment office in Lviv in Ukrainian. He said that now of all the letters that they send out to call people to come to the army, 80% they don't show up. Only 20% show up. And he says in the interview, which was an interview to kind of let the military explain why they are taking people straight off the street or going to people's jobs and taking them to the army from the job. He said that we can't, this is impossible. This is a threat to the Ukrainian war effort. So we need to use these things. A couple of weeks ago, Zelensky, he fired all the bosses of the recruitment centers because of corruption. It had been, it started when the boss of the recruitment center in Odessa, he was proven to have bought a house in Spain for 4.5 million euros. It was also shown that he went there for vacation. And remember that all men in Ukraine from the age of 18 to 63, they're not allowed to leave the country. He both bought the house, he bought a Mercedes for his wife, a Porsche for his aunt or something like this. And this was revealed by media, a small media channel. And then all the people, bosses for the recruitment offices in the whole of Ukraine were fired because it's a huge business. People they pay for not having to go to the army. They pay to have some sick, prove that they are sick. It was even proven that they can pay these recruitment offices and they will fix the route out of Ukraine. Zelensky was very, he used very hard words. He's called it betrayal. Now they have several different diagnoses. For instance, if you have HIV, you didn't have to go to the army before this. Now you have to go. If you had tuberculosis, you have to go, and so on. So several things. A lot more people, they have to go to the army. There was this case of a guy with epilepsy who actually died. He was brought in by the military police and he died a couple of days later. So this is one have to ask oneself why is 80% trying to run away from the army? And first, of course, one reason is the bloody counter-offensive. There was now intelligence from I think it was some kind of American intelligence service saying that 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers died, 100,000 were seriously wounded. This equals 1/3 of the whole Ukrainian army. And of course, with the counter-offensive, the war is even more bloody. So that's the first reason. We have an interview. We have a paper in Sweden, and we made an interview with a guy who lives now hidden in Ukraine. He doesn't want to go to the army. And he said that the first time when he was 18, the first question he got at the recruitment office was from the psychologist, how much does your parents make? Because he wanted to know how big a bribe could he get from this guy. That was the first impression that this guy got from the Ukrainian army. And the last couple of months, the corruption scandals has just been mounting. There was $980 million of weaponry who just either disappeared or they are delayed. No one knows if the weapons that the Ukrainian army bought for the money that they got from the West, have they just disappeared into some black hole? Or is the weapons somewhere in some boat, in some ocean somewhere? Another thing was that they bought winter jackets from Turkey for $30 million. When they turned up in the Ukraine, it proved to be summer jackets. And there was the German army discovered that having summer jackets in Russia, Ukraine is not a very good strategy if you are going to make an efficient war. There was also scandals of eggs being bought at, they could buy eggs at cheaper prices in any superstore in Ukraine, but they bought it from Turkey for high prices. So the guy, he said, well, I believe in the army in general, but our army is filled with corrupt people. If I would be on the front and my boss or officer would say, we have to attack, I don't know if I can trust that guy. I don't know if I have the weapons. I don't know if I have the jackets, the shoes, or anything like this. So that's another reason. I mean, we have to, and this is all, I think that this is something that is very rarely discussed in media. It's often Russia against Ukraine. But the Ukraine and Russia, it's class societies and deeply corrupt societies. In Russia, there are different parties in Ukraine. Every party is run by some oligarch or by some company. It only looks on the interest of this special guy or the special company. The police is so corrupt. I remember once being in a restaurant in Odessa. This big policeman comes in, goes to the cashiers and say, I want my money. He gets money, he just walks away. He didn't even try to hide it because corruption and bribes are so, it's a part of society. The courts are corrupt, media is corrupt. If ever a society was run by an elite, rich, corrupt, untouchable, it's the Ukraine. If ever there was a society where ordinary people feels powerless, where they, I mean, the salaries are not very high. Poor people without power, without any possibility of influencing their life, it's the Ukraine. And even before the war, I kind of had the impression that this society is falling apart because there is no, ordinary people doesn't believe in the elites, in the state, in the police, in the courts, in anything. Everyone wanted to leave. Young and educated people, they were looking towards the West because they wanted to have a computer job in the West. Older people, less educated people, they were looking towards the East and they were looking towards history. They were saying, I wish I was a pensioner in Soviet times because then people had respect for old people. Now people don't respect me as a pensioner. So they looked kind of back in history. So there's an elite making money now off of the war. And there's ordinary people dying in the trenches, almost like 100 years ago. I mean, this war is like First World War. Blood and lives being lost, and they gain 100 meters. And then they lose 100 meters, then they gain 100 meters. Who should we listen to? Should we listen to the 80% who don't show up for the recruitment offices? Or should we listen to Zelensky or anyone else from the elite? So this is, I think one demand that really could catch the heart of these 80%, it's start peace negotiations now. We could appeal to, it's like a real demand that's not in the future or can't be achieved. So, and I also think that this, if we look at the future for the workers' movement, for the Trotskyite movement, anti-militarism needs to be a very important part. There was, in the Swedish history, there was the left wing of the Social Democrats. They said, we don't want to be an armed almshouse. I think an almshouse is a house where poor people live. I think that's the right word, I don't know. But anyway, that was the word they used. And this will be I think this is the future. I mean, now all the healthcare, care for elderly, schools needs money in Sweden, and they just want to put money into the army. So I think anti-militarism is one of the most important things that we should focus on in the future.
the obstacles to its development. But of course, it's not any less gangsterish under Putin than it was before. It's just that it acquired some logic. So defending Putin is crazy. It's something that it should be out of our even thinking. I mean, we've heard people saying that he's under attack, so he had to defend himself. Yes, he had to defend what? The gangster capitalism of Russia. And this is something that we should always have in mind. And this is the level, I think, that Marxists should understand. And when we say it's imperialist war, doesn't mean that the imperialism of Russia or the imperialism of US are the same. They are not the same, but they are still clashing as imperialists, and they are they have earned this label both from the economic but also from the military adventures that they are in. Of course, Putin is not succeeding anything. I mean, he tried to break the encirclement of Russia, and he strengthened it. We have Sweden, we have Finland, and we don't know what next. I think, I don't remember who said it, but I think it was Trotsky, that Marxists should not try to see who started the war or who didn't start it. The question is, what result of this war is helping the proletarian revolution? That's what we should have in mind. And probably the worst result in all this is to have an outright win of the US and NATO against Putin. If we have this, then the US imperialists will manage to extend its life, to extend its domination of Europe and the rest of the world, and throw the prospect of revolution much further down the line. A win by Putin, again, it would be really bad, because there will be all sorts of illusions of the kind we had during the colonial revolution, that we can go for a revolution through the various, through BRICS, through Russia, through this sort of processes. And having seen who is Putin, I think we should realize, though, who is Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky came to power on a 70% vote, on a ticket for peace and the end of corruption. He never ended corruption, and he never tried for peace. This is something that should tell us something about how Ukrainians themselves feel about peace. Of course, when they are invaded, they don't know what to do, and we have people running away. We have people falling for the nationalistic slogans. What should we do? I think the only way I would approach the matter would be, we have to fight against Zelensky. We have to overthrow Zelensky and throw the Russians out. And this is the sort of line we should start building. This is the only way that the forces of the working class could have an echo in the working class of Russia, and have some result. At the same time, I think we should also consider what it will mean on the ground for the people of Donbass and Crimea, if there is a heavy defeat by Russia, they fall into the hands of the Ukrainian army. Do you think they will stay there? No, there will be a bloodbath, there will be ethnic cleansing unseen for up to now. And of course, we should have some call for peace, some call for negotiations, because peace, yes, it could be a platonic, used in a platonic way and don't have any teeth. But let's not forget that it could be revolutionary. The Bolshevik Revolution was built on the slogan "Peace, bread and peace." I mean, it's a very strong fighting word, peace. We should have this in mind. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Frank Peterson. I'm a member of the Swedish Workers Group. I was recruited to the Swedish section of the CWI in 1984. I was a full-timer for 18 years, mainly organizing and getting the money into the organization. I was a part of the split out of the Swedish section of the CWI in 2010. And now I work as a nurse at the hospital and doing as much as I can building Marxism on my free time. I want to take up the. I think the document is very good. I want to take up and raise the possibility that this war could be ended by pressure from an uprising peace movement. And of course, as long as capitalism exists, there will be wars. But I'm talking about this war. There is a war weariness among people all around the world. The consequences of the war is obvious. It's famine, it's inflation, it's death. And I think that the demand that was suggested by Janne, my Swedish comrade, about putting in the demand in the document that is, and I quote, immediate restart of peace negotiations is very good. And I also think that it is today a transitionary demand. A transitionary demand, that is, what is it? It is to start from the current consciousness among workers and youth and to suggest demands that questions the ruling elite's policies and with the aim to ignite a movement. And to demand peace talks now is just that. In the year 2003, there were 30 million who demonstrated around the world against the American war in Iraq. And this movement, it put pressure on governments all around Europe. It changed how much support the American army got from European countries. And then the movement also played its role in putting Jeremy Corbyn as an alternative leader for the British Labour Party. This movement for peace can happen again. And it could not only stop this war, it could shape the workers' movement from the bottom up. We have to remember that Putin, he does not have the social support that Hitler had during 1938-1942. There is no cues in Russia to enlist the war. And there is also no eager will to die for Zelensky, as it was in the Second World War to die for democracy against Hitler. So a peace movement outside the fighting countries could inspire people inside the fighting countries. Demands for peace inside of Russia could spark a movement from peace even there. And is this romantic dreams? I don't think so. Under which demands was the Russian Revolution 1917 ignited. It was bread, land, and peace. It was not a fight for socialism among the majority who fought. The demand for peace was extremely important. After the revolution, there were revolutionaries which wanted to continue the war, who were against the Brest-Litovsk peace settlement. It was ultra-leftists, which were strongly criticized by Lenin and Trotsky. Lenin and Trotsky, they understood the question of peace now among soldiers, workers, and farmers. If a peace movement would start, it wouldn't be petit bourgeois today. It would be in direct opposition to the existing governments. It would stretch out its hands to both the Russian and the Ukrainian people. And we as Marxists would of course intervene. We could meet workers and youth in our own neighborhoods and discuss the origin of war and also the need for socialism. And to ignite such a peace movement could be done at a local level, national level, or international level. So what is the alternative to suggest and work for something like that, and to put these kind of demands in a document? I think that the alternative is to stay in your chambers and write critical letters. And the alternative is to let them, Putin and NATO, fight the war out, to keep pouring weapons to Ukraine, to keep Russian and Ukrainian young men die in their thousands. And I don't support that alternative.
Well, thanks very much, Temos, and thanks very much, Frank. So I think we've got possibly, Ian is clapping, which is very good. I don't think we've got more than possibly three people wanting to speak now. So, well, including Andros, yes. So did you want to speak as well, David? Right, 4 then. Joe Duffy, you had your hand up for ages. Do you still want to speak or not?
Yes, I'll speak.
You want to go next then, and then I'll take Matthew, and then we've got 2 comrades in the room. Then I'm going to bring Roger in to sum up. Then, okay?
Okay. The first thing I'd like to say is that I find Roger's document absolutely inspirational. I don't like starting off paying tribute to a particular person or anything like that, but in terms of the arguments and arguing the position, an internationalist position, the position that he puts forward is a cold, clear analysis of the situation, the genesis of it, the nature of the conflict and the way out of it. I think for people to label him then and to label anyone who advances ceasefire, anyone who advances the idea of peace negotiations as somehow a Putin apologist, that's an attempt basically, essentially by all the right-wing media and the mainstream media to use that all the time for anybody who questions the NATO objectives, the NATO interpretation. It's an attempt to shut down any debate in relation to Ukraine. So I don't think anybody on the left should use the language of those of us who advocate a ceasefire and peace negotiations are somehow Putin apologists. If anything, we can point to the fact that NATO's objectives, which is to escalate the war, keep it going, prolong it, those objectives overlap to some degree with those who say we want, some on the left who say we want victory for Ukraine, because there's actually a considerable overlap in relation to the demands that both sides make. If we listen to Nancy Pelosi, I'm just looking for her quote there, a famous quote, which was quite recently. She said, "We don't need negotiations, we need a victory." Now, anytime I've discussed with people from Solidarity for Ukraine and so on, if I read their material, it's one of, let's go for victory for Ukraine. We want nothing less than a total victory. The borders exactly as they were. And we want an end to Putin, take him out, and so on. And again, an overlap with the position of NATO on this, all right? So we don't accuse those people on the left of being agents for NATO and spokespeople for NATO. So people who start accusing those of us who advocate a contrary position to what is put out in the mainstream media, for us to be labelled Putin apologists is basically, it's as I said, it's an attempt to shut down debate. It's an abusive term, and we don't go around using the same type of terminology in relation to themselves, okay? So if there is a victory for Ukraine, you have to ask, like, what kind of victory? Presumably the spring offensive, which is now an autumn offensive, and going into next winter, another winter offensive. And it's a stalemate. People reckon this war could go on for years. So the sort of destruction you've seen so far, the 500,000 deaths referred to so far, do we want that in terms of victory for Ukraine to the same amount, same level of destruction to continue? Do we want the same number of deaths? I know that this argument is open to criticism, but like that's basically what the scenario would be if we were talking about going for victory for Ukraine on the terms of what is being sought by the nationalists in Ukraine, the far right-wing nationalists, as well as fairly mainstream ones. It's no problem in them having that opening negotiation position, but it's not a position we should support. I'll come to the far right in a few minutes because we have a bit of experience of that in different countries to look at and how it can grow very, very, very quickly, by the way. So what's the alternative? In 2016, there was the Minsk Agreement. In that, it wasn't a question of handing over the Donbass and Crimea and so on over to Russia. There was actually support, considerable support for that. The Russians actually accepted the terms of it initially, right? Then the Ukrainians started kicking up about it. So the right-wing Ukrainians put pressure on the mainstream ones who were considering it, and it was shot down. Broadly the same terms were on offer again in only 1 month after the recent war, after the war started. If we say the war started with the invasion, I shouldn't really say the war started with the invasion, but anyway, 1 month after the invasion, in April 2022, there was the terms of the settlement was available again, brokered by none other than Israel and Turkey, and I believe a few others were involved as well. Russia was prepared to accept it. We were told as well, it was reported that Zelensky and many of this more what regarded as the more central or mainstream Ukrainian leaders and nationalists were prepared to go along with it. But the British intervened at the last minute on instructions from the Americans. No, we're going to work with the more extreme nationalists. We're going to keep the war going. Now that again is referred to in Roger's document, but it needs to be said here that there was a solution available. There was peace negotiations available, which could have ended this conflict, because broadly speaking, ultimately a solution will have to take into account what the Ukrainians will have to face. What are they going to do with Donbass? Is it going to be completely under the thumb of the Ukrainian ultranationalists? Or is there somehow going to be an autonomous solution which will guarantee equal rights for those who claim Russian descent, Russian values, Russian language, etc.? We just have to ask ourselves what we actually want here. I think that when the left forces who say victory for Ukraine, when they say the main task is to support Ukrainian workers, and that's the demand that they put forward, support Ukrainian workers. Well, what is the best way to support Ukrainian workers? Is it really to keep the war going? Do they actually think that they'll get a better solution at the end of another year of this conflict, other than what would broadly be acceptable right now, or what was acceptable in 2016, or what was acceptable again and put forward in April 2022? This war was really unnecessary. It was really the objectives of NATO have come to the fore. They have forced this through. This could have been ended. I'd say the best thing for Ukraine is for peace, a ceasefire, then negotiations. And in that, the borders of Ukraine under the Minsk Treaty were actually intact. It was just a question of how much autonomy and independence you gave to the troubled regions in the Donbass, and the Donbass, and the same in relation to Crimea. So ultimately, those are the two sticking points. Now, in Northern Ireland, we've had plenty of sticking points as well, and ultimately they were resolvable after a 30-year war. Hopefully, there won't be a 30-year war in Ukraine, because what was available in the north of Ireland with the agreement 20 years ago was available 50 years ago. It's just a question of whether people are willing to go for it. And the last point I'll make, because I'm aware that people have been listening a long time, the far right. Much is made of this figure that the far right are less than 2% of the population. Now, I'm not saying that they're more than 2% of the population. They got less than 2% of the vote in the last elections, about 4 or 5 years ago. Well, if you actually look at Northern Ireland in 1966, the IRA and the Republican forces, they numbered a handful almost. They were just completely isolated. But in the context of what they perceived and what the nationalist population in the north of Ireland perceived as a war, the IRA went from being a tiny force to being seen as legendary heroes, and they just recruited hand over fist in the heat of the conflict in 1969. The same thing is going to happen here in relation to Ukraine. The forces of Azov, the right sector, all the different right-wing groups who are absolutely the vanguard of the fighting forces in the eyes of a lot of the Ukrainian youth, their status in Ukrainian society is already, on the basis of things I've heard from some Ukrainian taxi drivers in Ireland, they told me that Azov, amongst the young people, they're absolute heroes. And when it comes to the next election, and when it comes to the post-war situation, whether if it's a victory for Ukraine, their status will be even further enhanced. And you can forget about the 2%. You just watch their support absolutely mushrooming. If it's a solution that comes about as a result of a ceasefire, maybe they will not quite have the same level of support, but they will be the vanguard, and they will represent a significant minority who, like happened in Ireland in 1922, will oppose the settlement, and they will become the leaders and the vanguard of the fighters for an anti-settlement group who will then want to wage war yet again on the enclaves that they started off their campaign in 2014 in the Donbass and the Crimean area. So, people need to just, really think, not just in terms of what statically was existing in 2018, 2019 in relation to Azov and a lot of the right-wing groups. You need to look at where they are now. What is their status now? What is the view of the Ukrainian people now of those, particularly the young people? And finishing this point, when you get a war which has inflicted the damage that has been done on Ukraine for the last 16, 17 months. And you get that in conjunction with, on top of the horrific oppression over decades in relation to Ukraine by Russia, the perspective of the average person in the Ukraine, average worker in Ukraine, is going to be a nationalist. So that it's very easy to tap into that nationalism, very easy to fall for that analysis, right? But it's very, very difficult to see how they're going to get out of it. But we need to keep our heads and make sure that we have an internationalist perspective, which is explain where this has come from. Look at, don't discount, as an awful lot of those who say we're Putin apologists, they completely discount the 30 years of NATO encirclement, NATO advances and so on. That's all forgotten about. They don't seem to care really about the prospect of another 500,000 deaths, mostly of Ukrainians perhaps, or equal, maybe 50-50. So I just think that we're advancing what's best for Ukrainian workers by advancing for a ceasefire, advancing the idea of peace negotiations. And remember, this is not theory. This was the bones of a settlement which is acceptable to significant sections of Ukrainian people in 2016 and the Minsk Treaty 2, and again in April 22. The bones of a settlement was there. It was I'm not saying it was on the verge of being accepted, but it was certainly, if it got the backing of the Ukrainian politicians, instead of them capitulating the last minute to the pressure from the British and Americans, it would have gone through. And I believe ultimately, whether it's 6 months' time, 3 months' time, or 2 years' time, the solution will roughly will once again focus on exactly what came up in 2016, the areas around Donbass and the Crimea. So they're the two areas which will ultimately determine what happens. Okay, sorry for going on there. Okay.
Right, thanks very much, Joe. Right, given the time, I think I'm going to ask the remaining comrades to just keep the remarks as concise as they can. We've obviously covered a lot of the ground already, and we don't need to keep repeating the same thing, if you get me drift. So I'm actually going to let Keith speak next, because he's just put his hand up, he's not spoken all day. We'll then take Matthew. We've got Andros and David Hemson. Then I'm going to bring Roger back in just to sum up, hopefully to get finished for about 6 o'clock. Okay, so Keith, do you want to go ahead? Now you need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
I very much agree with the general approach which Roger's document has presented. But I particularly wanted to, I think that the nature of the war is very much changed and determined in terms of our response by the way in which imperialism has attempted to encircle Russia and NATO's policy and so on, American imperialism's policy. What I particularly wanted to do, though, was to echo the comments made by the two comrades from Sweden, because it seems to me that what should be in the list at the end in fact, prominently in the list at the end of Roger's document is the demand for immediate negotiations and the slogan of peace. And I think that there's the thing about military expenditure is also very important. I think the point that the comrade made about military expenditure and militarism generally is compared to when I was a young person, you can't actually question how much is spent on military. Nobody has any idea how much is actually spent on these weapons, and like in America, it's just a non-starter. Nobody can debate it. Nobody can object to it. And I think at a time when all of the people's standard of living is plummeting, this needs to be brought right to the centre of people's consideration. What are we doing, stoking this expenditure on weapons to kill people, when there's plenty of other things we should be spending our money on? And it seems to me that that raising the whole question of military expenditure and militarism generally does hit at the heart of the whole priorities of the society we're in. And we have in this country, of course, the experience of the Lucas Aerospace shop stewards' attempts in the 1970s to talk about how we can spend money on different things, socially useful production, and it's, I think it's also directly applicable, the notion of the workers' movement coming up with alternative ways to use the resources in society is directly applicable to the fight against fossil fuels, because we have to have an answer for people who work in the fossil fuel industry, and we have to be able to explain to people that there is a different road, and so I think that all round the whole question of militarism and peace is at the centre of what we should be doing, and I think that there needs to be discussion about what is the practical implications for socialists of demanding peace negotiations. How do we hang that? How do we go about it? What alliances do we make, and so on? That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Matthew.
Okay, yeah, I also agree, and I agree with Keith and also the comrades from Sweden, which I think their contribution has been very useful. Talking obviously directly of experience of the Ukrainian people in terms of the resistance to the war, etc. I think there's a few things that we need to draw out though. The first thing is, of course, Ukraine is a multinational country. That actually contains a series of, you have essentially a country which contains a series of minorities, whether that's Ukrainians, Russians, Tatars, Romanians, Hungarians, Poles, Jews. And the thing is that what obviously the process of history has been to kill or expel some of those minorities. Notably, obviously, the Jews who fled or were killed by various forces, particularly the far right of Ukrainian and German in particular, and the Poles, of course. When the Bandera forces in the Second World War weren't spending their time massacring the Jewish population, they were killing the Polish population. And then, of course, obviously, the joys of dear old Uncle Joe Stalin. He expelled the entire Polish population of Lvov to Wrocław. So, okay, well, you guys, you don't belong here. You can go and spend your time in what was Breslau, German town of Breslau, which is now Wrocław. And if you go to Wrocław, it's actually, you can see this whole chunk of old Polish Lvov in it, including cultural artifacts, the university, the whole lot. So, with those terms, that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that the nature of Russia. I don't agree. Probably I'm alone in this and saying that Russia is a imperialist country. It's not actually doesn't actually fulfil, Lenin's view of an imperialist country, because it's a kleptocracy. Actually, it's oligarchs who spend their time trying to remove themselves and their money, or the money they've stolen, out of Russia to the main imperialist countries, which is why as many of them and their families as possible live in London and Switzerland and Cyprus and the US, and they're determined to, obviously, apart from anything else, Russia's far too dangerous a place to live in if you can afford not to. And in that sense, I think the problem is, of course, is also this auto equation that says, well, if it's not an imperialist country, therefore we have to support it in war. I think that's a redundant notion. The key question here is, what is the interest of the work in any war? What is the interest of the working class? And the interest of the working class is with neither side in this case. There's no question of that. So the other thing is, and I think the other thing that has to be borne in mind all the time, is that this is a NATO war. This is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is a war between NATO and Russia. The town of Rzeszów in Poland, southwestern Poland, which was a sleepy railway town, has been turned into probably one of the world's largest military depots in order to supply Ukraine. Ukraine wouldn't exist without continuous supply of material from Western Europe, the US, etc., etc. This entire war has been fought on that basis. There are NATO personnel existing, fighting within and advising, giving orders within Ukraine. It's a NATO war. Now the question is, becomes, okay, how much further does NATO escalate this war? Because clearly they're set on doing it. I think the other thing, there's other point in terms of history, is to say, okay, well, what can we extract from the history of the Bolshevik effort in Ukraine and the creation of the Bolshevik Ukrainian government, which I think is worth investigating, which is actually the only force which defended the Jews in Ukraine and sought to liberate the place. Whereas, in fact, the Ukrainian far right has always been, whether that's the Rada in 1918, which was a cat's paw of the Imperial German Army, or the OUN, the far right OUN in the Second World War, which was cat's paw of the Wehrmacht and Hitler, or the current lot, the Azov battalion and the assorted other fascists in Ukraine, and it was essentially a cat's paw of the US imperialism. But in fact, of course, all of these forces seek to bind Ukraine to imperialism and of course to a thoroughly miserable existence. I mean, as I think the comrades in Sweden outlined, the point being is that actually even before the war, Ukraine had seized the title of the most miserable, poorest country in Europe from Moldova next door. You know, I mean, it was a shithole. It's got worse, of course. People's normal and reasonable response to that, of course, is to flee. And so what you're seeing, of course, is the depopulation of Ukraine. And a large number of people have left the country quite recently, and they won't return. Why should they? What's the point? You know, I mean, unless they go and visit. I think the other thing is to point to the Minsk negotiation, which Merkel herself, who was involved, said was essentially a fit up in order for the imperialists to prepare themselves for this war. You know, it wasn't something that they wanted to actually make work. They just wanted a pause so they could prepare for war. Now, when Zelensky, of course, who was a puppet of Kolomoisky, who's just been arrested for some, because obviously there's been falling out and there's sort of corrupt elements of Ukraine, said, to the people fighting in the war in Donbass, look, we need to stop this. And well, if you try to do that, we'll kill you. That's it. You may have been elected on that basis, but if you do that, we'll kill you. There's no subtlety in these questions. I think the other point here. Sorry?
You can start winding up.
No, sure. No, I think apart from obviously, as I say, the corruption. The other point I think we need also is to understand that the disaster that's happened in Ukraine in terms of this counter-offensive, which has resulted in the deaths of probably 100,000 odd Ukrainians, never mind Russians, was supposed to get to the Black Sea, has probably advanced no more than a few kilometers, has expended vast amounts of material that have been handed over by NATO. Biden actually said he was going to fight to the last Ukrainian. Now, the last Ukrainian is in sight. They are getting to that point. This is why they're seizing people off the street to shove them in the army, because they have people who wanted to die, who wanted to fight. They've all died, or have been crippled, or whatever else. Everybody else, of course, is now being dabbed to say, right, you lot can do some dying now. This is the point we're getting to. The question really for us is, what do the imperialists and the crazy Biden administration do now? And the final thing is, and I think what some comrades have actually pointed towards, is we need to build an anti-war movement. There's an absolute necessity in the West. We need an anti-war movement against this crap because it threatens all of us.
That's it. Thanks very much, Matthew. Thank you, Matthew. Right, so there's no more time for all the speakers and the ones that are listed. So we're going to take Andros, and then David, and then Roger, who are all in the room. So we'll come up one at a time, okay?
Essentially, comrades, I want to inform you about the position of internationalist standpoint. We discussed Ukraine with Roger initially, just over a year ago when we came into contact. And we were very glad to see that our positions were identical. And it was also important that they were developed entirely independent. And this, of course, happened with other groups internationally that we are discussing with the contact. And we're in contact, and I think this is also important. So we were very positively impressed by the positions that were developed by Roger on behalf of WIN. But we also appreciated very much the fact that there was a difference in the ranks of WIN on the part of the French comrades, and the discussion took place in a very comradely, friendly way. For us, this was very important. Because through our experiences anyway,
we think that many splits take place without serious reason, and that in an organization, national or international, there should be room for different opinions, even if they're serious. Now, this seems to have changed in the last couple of weeks. I think the documents presented by Comrade John Ryman and by the French comrades raise the tones, and also they question things like fundamental historical facts, and it doesn't help the discussion. It's a bit disappointing. I think that Roger's recent document is quite accurate on the historical facts, on the way things developed. And I agree with what Themos said before, that you can have no confidence in what the bourgeois media state, but you can find out the truth. If you read the various versions, if you investigate things a little bit, you can see the shape of things, how they are objective. And of course, there's always the possibility to contact people in Ukraine, like the Swedish comrades have done, and we've done also in Greece. There's quite a big Greek minority living in Ukraine, in the eastern parts, particularly in the city of Odessa. And we know that in the past years, first of all, there was a civil war taking place in Ukraine between the state and the East, the Russophones. And we were in contact with the Russophones. And they were really desperate. And they were saying, where is Putin to come and save us? That was the feeling in the Russophones before the war. After the war, we spoke also with people from the region. I'm not saying that we spoke with thousands, you know, so they're indicative. And if there are questions about whether this information is accurate or not, then we should simply investigate more and demand the right of freedom of expression of the people in the area. After the war started, we spoke with people who stay in Odessa, and their position was, we don't like Putin. But if Putin doesn't come, we will be shot by the fascists, by the Nazis. Therefore, we support Putin not because we like him, but because we have no option. And this is very sensible in a situation in which you have a minority of Russophones who are afraid of the state because the state is suppressing them, and there is no question about it. Months before the war took place, Zelensky prohibited the speech of Russian language. Now, this in itself is telling a lot. Under what conditions, what kind of a state is this? And why does it forbid the right of some people to speak their language, particularly when this minority is between 30 and some claim to be 50%, but even 30% is a massive minority. So you have this kind of state. And this is the root of the civil war taking place there in the East. And of course, we have to listen to some of the key people. Roger mentioned some names. Kissinger is very important. But I will remind the comrades, and if there's any question about, I can send the link of James Stavridis' position immediately after the war. It was a couple of weeks. He was the previous head of NATO. And he said, these were his words, Putin has given us a God-sent present to NATO. So thank Putin for invading Ukraine, because this allows NATO to go for Russia. This was the meaning of what he said. So it is correct that Russia was provoked. And it is correct to say that NATO did not do this naively or out of ignorance. It was a conscious policy to provoke Russia. But again, this does not mean that we support Russia, because it's a struggle between a war between two imperialist powers. We use actually we use the kind of three wars taking place at the same time that Roger mentioned. We use a similar expression. We say that this war has three aspects. One aspect is Russia against Ukraine. The other aspect is the Ukrainian state against the Russophone minority. And the third aspect is NATO and Russia. All of these are important aspects of the war, but what is the dominant aspect? The dominant aspect is the war between NATO and Russia. And some organizations in the anti-capitalist left, they try to deny that NATO is involved. But NATO is fully involved. It doesn't have an army of NATO there, but it has generals, it has arms, it has... this is the biggest arms shift that has taken place after this is the Financial Times claiming it, after the end of the Cold War, and probably after the end of the Second World War. Such a massive shift of weaponry, and the know-how, and the mercenaries, thousands of them. One of them, an English mercenary, said there are 20,000 mercenaries fighting from the West in Ukraine. So NATO is there, and because the dominant characteristic of this war, it's a struggle between two major imperialist powers, despite the fact that Russia is a secondary imperialist power compared to the US, we cannot support either side. And the position, the traditional position of revolutionaries, that the main enemy is at home, takes shape there. Now, when it comes to the demands, it's impossible from the distance, from outside, to be very accurate about the formulation of the demands and how do we specifically raise the demands and how we specifically phrase the demands. We have to be there. But unfortunately, from what I read from Ukrainian lefts who claim to be Trotskyist revolutionaries, etc., I haven't seen a revolutionary position. I have seen a left nationalist position. Some of the groups that claim to be Trotskyist, you read the material, defend Ukraine, but no criticism of Zelensky, and no raising of the demand of self-determination of the people in the East. This is not a revolutionary policy. So I would also echo the demands raised by other comrades, Roger in the document and other comrades in this discussion, against the Russian invasion, troops out of Ukraine, defend the Ukrainian people against the Russian invasion, support the Russian people and the Russian youth against Putin, defend Ukrainian people against the invasion, but fight against Zelensky. You cannot keep quiet on this aspect if you want to be in the revolutionary left. And of course, by necessity, the right of the people of Eastern Ukraine to their self-determination. I think that's about it.
Comrades, this is a vital discussion. My points will, however, hopefully be focused and fairly brief. First of all, two quotes, both from a radio program I heard, and I think both were genuine. This is a Russian blogger, a militarist. War unites us and makes us strong. There is quite a, sorry, let me give you the next one. This is from a Polish person who rang in immediately thereafter and says words to this effect: Ukrainians, you are fighting for us. A Polish person, right? You're doing the work for us. Now, I just throw that in because it impressed me in this way. First of all, you know, there is a strong militarism in depth in the Russian state and or Russian society, as we've seen with the crazy behavior with Wagner, which came and it seems to have gone. the self-destructive process that was there. But then also, I've been trying to think through why NATO expanded, so rapidly, the figures that Roger gave. And it seems to me, and I think we need to deal with this too, is that obviously there was a vacuum in power relationships as the USSR, Russia, collapsed. NATO moved in, but it was also welcomed in. And the fact that has been often stated, we haven't mentioned it, but I suppose it needs to be registered either as an important fact or not, is that no attacks have been made on countries which have been part of NATO. In other words, Poland and a range of other weak East European countries feel that there's some security against Russian imperialism. Now, why should they fear Russian imperialism? I think we have to recognize that Russia's occupation of Poland and all the countries to the north of Eastern Europe was not happy, a happy time, and is remembered with great resentment. Now, I'm not then therefore saying they should have joined NATO, not at all. But it does explain something of how that vacuum was filled and why the American ruling class broke the rules which Keenan and others had said, who are Cold War warriors, do not go in and infuriate the bear. It explains something of the logic there when the Russian state collapsed. And I think we have to deal with that in terms of this proxy element. It is a proxy war, but this proxy element of the Eastern Europeans feeling that the Ukrainians are fighting for them because of their history. Now, I just want to mention two other things. First of all, the peace movement. At the moment, we have a sort of a peace movement in South Africa and in America. But it is basically on the basis that, Putin was not wrong to invade. Look, America started this war. This is the way it would go. And we need peace at any cost right now, be able to stop the war. In other words, whatever Putin sets as the terms, and I think it's been raised that it's about time we actually heard the terms, because nobody's actually putting down what their terms are for a settlement. That needs to be addressed and understood. Is it the whole of Ukraine, although that obviously was the original intention, or is it just to defend the Donbass and to get a secure self-determination for them on one base or other? But I do think that a peace movement is very needed at the moment. As people have raised the point that we've had a massive, 4 to 5 million were in demonstrations against the invasion of Iraq. And that was a massive movement. And now really there's not much. The basis for that movement should be, in my view, and I think it's also already been mentioned, is that this is in the same language as Rosa Luxemburg, this is barbarism of unlimited war. This is what we've seen. There are certain limits. I mean, it's an asymmetrical war. I mean, cruise missiles are coming in on Kiev and on Ukraine. NATO will not give cruise missiles yet to Ukraine to strike back in Moscow. So, they are trying to make some sort of Cold War limitations on it, but all of that could run out of control. The basis we should be raising is that this war is a disaster for the working class. The resources which should be available to be able to build, to be able to alleviate the poverty and the misery in the periphery of capitalism and in the center of capitalism is now all being deployed to the war effort. The food prices are going through the roof. I'm astonished at the prices here in Britain after being away for about a year or so. I mean, there's an astonishing, rise in prices on all levels. And in Africa, this has been a devastation. It shouldn't be a devastation, but the problem is under colonialism, African people became dependent on imports. Even Nigeria imports rice and things like it used to export rice. So we now become dependent on world markets, and this war is reinforcing that dependence. as well, oil prices are going through the roof. No war can be fought without rising oil prices. That is a security question, and it's a displacement of resources to the fossil fuel sector. Imagine all this nice talk of climate change and all kinds of green economies and technologies, and all of the resources are going towards oil. It's opening up everywhere, as in Britain and also in America as well. We're killing ourselves by allowing this to take place. I want to end on a particular point to Olivier. Comrade, I'm sorry we missed a lot of your points. I've sent you an email to say please send those so that we can as well read what you've said as well as shared. Unfortunately, I didn't hear as well as I could. The second point is a broader one. If there are comrades from Ukraine or from Russia, from any aspect who actually have a particular point of view to be stated, let's hear them at our conferences. They are not excluded from our conferences. There's been criticism maybe of the different people who've said to be socialists in Ukraine, but let's hear if they are genuine and they want to build a workers' international. Let's hear them. We are not denying a voice at all. Let them be heard. Thank you.
Okay, comrades. I think this discussion today has been positive. We've learned a lot from it. I think it's a lot better than the written discussion that preceded it. And let's keep to those principles of how to conduct a discussion from now on. I'm not going to reply to every point that's made, but I like to say, well, first of all, I'm sorry that Bob Archer doesn't seem to be with us anymore, but never mind. He's an old friend of mine and he's a neighbour, and I'll definitely catch up with him and answer him as soon as I can get access to him. But he was not listening to a word that we're saying. He hasn't read the document or listened to what we were saying. He said the whole content of his contribution was how wrong it would be to say that we must support Russia. When? Just when and where did I or any of us say or write anywhere that we should support Russia? On the contrary, pages and pages in my documents were saying the opposite. I'm just because this was also said or implied in the document of the French comrades. I just want to repeat. So just a couple of quotes again from our documents. We said that the reason why we talked about Russia as a secondary regional imperialist power precisely as an answer to those feeble-minded lefties who we've seen a lot of in the last period, who've defended Russia as a victim. Russia is not a victim. Russia was an aggressor in Ukraine, and we've condemned the invasion. We've called, as our first demand was withdraw the Russian troops, and we didn't say, as was deceptively alleged, just withdrawal of all occupation forces. We said Russia, hands off Ukraine. That was the very first demand. But nobody is talking about that. So let me just say, Bob made a big point again and said, look, Putin didn't want to just occupy the east. He wanted to seize the whole of Ukraine. Again, it's there in my documents again and again. There's just need one sentence. Behind Putin's menacing message, quote, we are ready to show you what genuine decommunization means for Ukraine, unquote. Behind that message lies the threat of extinction of Ukraine as a nation in the ugliest traditions of Tsarist tyranny. It could not be clearer than that. I think, well, I don't need to labour the point more. But Yes, sorry, one last thing. Talking about the population of Donbass, we didn't say they have to join, they rightfully should belong to part of Russia. This is what we wrote. Now, as a result of the great power games played by great powers above their heads, the people of Donbass find themselves helpless victims trampled underfoot by a brutal conflict between rival occupying armies. Again, I don't know how it could be put any more clearer than that. What we're saying is a very, very simple thing. That it's well, I'll come to that. I'll finish off with what we're saying in very, very simple terms. In terms so simple that nobody could misunderstand them or distort them any longer. Because first of all, I'd like to particularly thank Patrick for his brilliantly clear exposition of the real balance, particularly as far as the eastern Ukraine is concerned. That he says, yeah, listen to the Ukrainians. Listen to which Ukrainians? That's a very, very good question to ask, because it's a civil war that is one of the aspects of the war. As we said, I'm very, I must say, I think it's really felicitous that the way that I formulated things was that this is three wars going on, and Andros said that there's three aspects of the war. It's exactly the same thing. It is. There are three things going on here, and they're all interconnected, but they're also all separate. On the question of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, absolutely solidarity with the people of Ukraine, solidarity with those people who want to be free from Russian domination. Whether that applies to the East or not, we're not saying, because it's not our business. As I've made clear in the opening, that it's for the people to decide whether they want to be part of Ukraine, whether they want to be an autonomous region, whether they want to be an independent state, whether they want to be an autonomous region within Russia, whether they want to be swallowed up by Russia, which is very, very unlikely. But any of those things is a choice for the people of East Ukraine to make. I was very interested to hear. I'm going to finish with that point. Sorry. Well, the point that I'm sorry, I'm losing my. Oh yes, I just wanted to say something about because David referred to the attitude of the peoples of some of the occupied nations within the old Soviet Union. I was actually, I've got to give a little bit of, and again, a bit of a personal history, if you don't mind, very, very briefly. But I told you that my father's father was from Odessa. My mother's mother was from Riga in Latvia, and I was a student of Russian many decades ago. And as part of that time, I spent 1 year in Russia. Not as a student, I was actually working as a editor and translator for Progress Publishers, which some comrades may remember. And during that time, I was curious to see the birthplace of my grandmother. So I said I wanted to pay a visit to Latvia, to Riga. So of course, those the Soviet state was always very generous in not only allowing people to travel, but actually giving them the assistance of a guide to go with them and show them around. So I had a very nice guy who came as an escort, who was obviously KGB. I mean, he hardly made any sense of it. But I just remember one incident there when we were walking through the streets in Riga, and we got lost. So our guide stopped somebody in the street and asked them for directions. And the answer that came very, very gruffly from the person that he stopped was, "Я не говорю по-русски. I don't speak Russian." And the reply that he gave was very interesting too. "Научим, we'll teach you." Now that shows the relationship very, very well of Russia and those states. Okay, so absolutely right. Hatred of the Russian occupation, and it's not at all surprising that when the USSR collapsed, that first one and then another, Hungary and Poland and all of them, and of course the Baltic republics and all of them could not wait to break away and so on. Quite understandable and so on. And of course exploited mercilessly by the nascent capitalist class there, and by American imperialism and by NATO. But I want to finish just with this question, really. There's one thing that we're always being asked by John Ryman, and we're asked again in Olivier's document, is why don't we listen to what the Ukrainian socialists say? Well, I agree very much with what David said at the end. Sure, bring them along. Let's discuss with them. We'd be very glad to hear what they say, and we'd be very glad to be able to give them the chance to hear what we have to say and to discuss with them. And like we would with people anywhere else, we would discuss with socialists anywhere. But from what we're told by Olivier and by John Ryman, what do these, I don't know if there's any other Ukrainian socialists, but these Ukrainian socialists, apparently, they support the Russian, the American intervention. In fact, they demand that more weapons be sent from NATO and US imperialism to support the government. They support Zelensky. They don't. Well, tell us. Do they stand for self-determination for the peoples of the eastern provinces? Do they or don't they? If they are sure that the people of the east want to remain within Ukraine, then what are they afraid of? They should say yes. We want self-determination. We want to give them the chance to decide. Let them vote without any pressure or intimidation from either side. Let them. I mean, it could be done. It could be done with the United Nations referendum or something like that. I mean, there are ways in order to have at least a reasonably open or honest referendum and an expression of self-determination. So what do the Ukrainian socialists say? What we would do, you see, people keep asking us, well, do we support this? If we don't support the American and NATO armaments for Ukraine, then we're leaving them to dry and so on. Well, the point is, who are we? There's a few of us, there's 11 of us, I think, in this room, and there's maybe 30 or 40 people in total, maybe 50 at one time, listening in. But we have not got the resources to have an independent position, if you like. All we can do at this stage, and I hope it's only at this stage, and it won't stay like that, all we can do at this stage is comment, analyse, put forward demands, propagandise, agitate, explain what our ideas are and so on. But if we were a force, what would we do? We would have an international brigade in Ukraine. We would do what the Labour movement did in the Spanish Civil War. They didn't, well, some supported the Popular Front government, but there were independent forces in the International Brigade who supported POUM and supported the revolution, supported the anarchists in Barcelona and so on. We would say, mobilize a workers' army to go there and to fight for demands that we're talking about, solidarity of the working class. We would make an appeal to the Russian troops. Have these socialists in Ukraine done anything to appeal on a class basis to the peoples of the eastern provinces? Have they made an appeal to the Russian troops? After all, the Russian troops dying, tens of thousands, according to one estimate, which may be exaggerated, we don't know, but they say 120,000 Russian troops have been killed and probably 500,000 altogether injured or wounded or, you know, in one way, victims of the war. They must be open to propaganda, not to NATO propaganda, but they must be open to workers' internationalist propaganda to say why are we fighting this war? What is the quarrel about? There's no quarrel between the workers of Russia and the workers of Ukraine. I mean, it's very clear what an independent socialist position would be. So all we're asking, we're not saying support Russia. That's just, I mean, it's just childish for comrades, for anybody to try to imply that we are. And we're not certainly saying support Ukraine and support Zelensky and support NATO and support the US imperialists. All we're asking for is an independent workers' socialist program. That's all we do in any situation. That is, I cannot understand why so much confusion, so much dust has been thrown into our eyes on this question. What we are standing for is socialist internationalism. We stand it. Look, Lenin didn't say, that we should support Russia because it's under attack from American girl. But I mean, he called Tsarist Russia a prison house of nations. Putin is trying to recreate a Tsarist-style prison house of nations. America is trying to dominate the whole of Europe and to try to make a war against Russia, and that only as a kind of precursor to a real war, an all-out war. And, that means an all-out world war and very possibly a nuclear war against China. All we're saying is we want an independent position representing the needs and the interests of the working class of Russia, of Ukraine, and of the world. And that's all this is about. That's correct.
So thanks to the comrades that have just spoken, Andros and Dave, and thanks to Roger for his excellent summing up of this debate. That's the end of the session for today. We're back tomorrow at 9:30 when we'll be discussing Roger's document Building the International. So I hope you can all join us tomorrow, and thank you very much for coming along today. I hope you've enjoyed the conference and I hope you found it worthwhile.